Let's share a screen and we'll get started. All right, so we are in Parshat Beha'alotecha, which is sort of a central point in Sefer Bamidbar. It has in it some psukim that I think are familiar to everyone here, which is the Vayehi B'Soah Haaron. And there's something quite remarkable about the way that they appear, those psukim appear in the Torah, is that they're surrounded by inverted nuns, kind of like parentheses. And so many suggest, hi Robert and Rena, many suggest that it's in order to show us that this is how things could have and should have been. That those inverted nuns are kind of saying, it's like you think of the Choose Your Own Adventure books. So we could have followed the path of the inverted nuns and traveled with the ark leading us into Eretz Yisrael. And instead, we have what follows immediately after, which is one of the first of many, 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 many complaints, which really serve as the major theme for the second part of Sefer Bamidbar, is all the complaints and everything that went wrong. So we could have chosen path A. Unfortunately, we chose path B. And so Beha'alotecha is the pivotal point in the book of Bamidbar, which is worth thinking about. We're actually going to focus on the section that comes immediately before those inverted nuns, right before the psukim of Vayehi B'Soah Haaron. We have, the nation is all set, ready to go, right? If we follow that understanding of what the inverted nuns represent, they are literally on the cusp, about to begin their final march into Eretz Yisrael. And right, the very last thing we read about before the camp starts to disassemble and travel is this exchange between Moshe and Chovav ben Reuel Hamidyani, Chotein Moshe. A man who's identified as Chovav or Chovev ben Reuel, the son of Reuel, from Midian, Chotein Moshe, the father-in-law of Moshe. There are different ways that some of the commentators read that description of this man. Some read it as Chovav ben Reuel Hamidyani, comma Chotein Moshe, that it is identical, right? Chovav ben Reuel the Midianite, who was the father-in-law of Moshe, i.e. Chovav is his father-in-law, so in which case this Chovav is in fact Yitro, as we know him from Sefer Shmot. Others say that it's actually Chovav, comma, ben Reuel Hamidyani Chotein Moshe, that Chovav is Yitro's son, Moshe's brother-in-law. He's one generation down, and that Reuel is in fact the name of Yitro, which is how he's identified in Sefer Shmot when we first encounter him as after Moshe saves his daughters, he's identified as Reuel. So everyone has to sort of do a few somersaults to explain exactly who this person is. Most understand that it is in fact Yitro. And why is he called Chovav ben Reuel if he elsewhere is identified as Reuel? He can't write, is he Reuel ben Reuel? They say yes, just like in some traditions you have, George the First and George the Second. So, people would take on the name of their father, or at least in some circumstances. Wasn't uncommon in the Bible for people to have multiple names or multiple identities. So that's how most work around that little minor point, which actually can be quite a complicating factor. We're going to assume that the person that we're dealing with is Yitro, is in fact Moshe's father-in-law, but I do note that there are those who have a different understanding of who exactly he's speaking with. So anyway, Moshe turns to Chovav, we'll call him Yitro, we'll call him the father-in-law, and he says to him, Nosima nachal makom asher amar Hashem, oto otin lachem, lecha itanu v'itavnu lach, ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael. we are about to travel to the place that God has promised us, that he's going to give to you. Right? He said, I will give to you. Come with us. V'heitavnu lach. We will do good for you, because Hashem has spoken good about Israel. And presumably Israel there means the Jewish people, but it could mean the land that they're going to. Right? How we translate that Israel is also quite interesting. Vayomer elav lo elech. Yitro says back, I will not come with you. Ki im el artzi ve'el moladati elech. I will go back to my land and my birthplace. Vayomer al ma ta'azov otanu. Moshe says, please don't leave us. Ki al ken yadata chanotenu ba'midbar, v'hita lanu le'inayim. You know all of our encampments in the desert. V'hayita lanu le'inayim. One of the weirdest phrases we'll find in the Torah, and there's some weird phrases in the Torah. It translates literally as, you were for us our eyes. V'hayita lanu le'inayim. You were as eyes for us. Right, there's a big debate, is it v'hayita in the past tense, or should that be transferred into the future tense? You will be for us as eyes. But in any case, what does it mean that Yitro is going to be eyes for the Jewish people? It's a strange phrase. V'haya ki telechi imanu, v'haya tofahu asher yetiv Hashem imanu ve'tavnu lach. And if or when you go with us, then all the good that God has promised to us will happen to you also. Vayisume har Hashem derech shloshet yamim, v'aron v'it Hashem noseh lifneihem derech shloshet yamim, lator lahem menucha. They traveled from the mountain of God for 3 days, and the ark of the covenant of God traveled before them for 3 days in order to find a resting spot. Va'anan Hashem alehem yomam v'nasam min hamachaneh. And the cloud of God was over them when they traveled from the camp. Okay, so it's a rather strange interaction between Moshe and his father-in-law. Before I already gave some of the questions in noting the difficulty in translating it, but what, if anything, jumps out at you in this brief interaction? Anything strike you as a bit strange or something that needs further explanation? Questions that you have, reactions?
It is confusing. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
It really is. The question of whether, because he is a convert, he will receive any land is in the background now.
Right.
It's kind of like the elephant in the room, you know.
Right, Moshe promises that whatever good God has promised us will happen to you, but that's not entirely true. Meaning, there's a lot of good that God promised them as they're about to enter Israel, and some of that good might be accessible to Yitro, but all of it was not, right? He would not gain a portion of land, and, right, unclear, right? You take for granted that he was a convert. It's unclear that he actually converted. But right, if he did convert, he still would not be. He would not have land. If he didn't convert, then he would have a lower social status. He would not be. He would be a ger toshav.
It's one of the ways of. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say it's one of the ways of reading the number of names that he has. No, he is a convert because of the changes in the names. That seem to indicate coming closer and closer to Hashem. And some would say that he's called Chovav because he was willing to do so with knowing that he would not receive land.
Right.
Right. But
the word, just so everyone's on the same page, Chovav means to hold dear or to love. The yeshiva that I went to is Chovavei Torah, which means those who love or hold close to Torah. It's the same word as Chovav.
Right. And they it also shows stages in the relationship between Moshe and him. I was
Mhm.
just thinking, I haven't seen it written out quite that way, but they had
kind of
kind of a formal relationship, it felt like in the beginning, and then but then he asked permission from him. Moshe always showed respect to him, but then of course their power relationships changed drastically once they're reunited, and he gave him advice and on legal matters, and he did follow some of it, but we aren't privy to much of their interactions. But if we look upon the changes that came with all those names over a period of time, we can see a closeness growing between the two of them. That may be a way to approach that problem.
Certainly a change in relationship, and it's also maybe a change in Yitro, right? It might be indicative of version status. Go ahead, Robert.
Yitro is perceptive. Yitro understands things. He sees things.
Mm-hmm.
He's the eyes.
Right.
He's been offered, come along with us 3 days from here, and so on and so on. And you will be blessed as we are because you're part of this and so on. That's not just some empty promise. That's Moshe Rabbeinu telling his father-in-law, if Moshe has any ability to keep his word, he will keep his word. And his father-in-law does not have faith in him. He has faith in Ribono Shel Olam and so on, but he does not trust Moshe, or maybe he doesn't trust Bnei Yisrael to follow Moshe.
Where do you see that? I mean, that's a very interesting read of it. Is there
the fact that he turns down the offer. Moshe is the head of a people of 600 and whatever thousand, or 3 million, or whatever. Moshe has access to power, to wealth. Moshe functions in a certain fashion as the king, as the supreme human authority in this community, in this society. And he makes a promise. He makes a commitment. He offers a commitment. And his father-in-law turns him down.
Interesting.
And it's a strange thing to do. But then again, if one doesn't trust the father-in-law, without making any specific references to anybody, it raises a question. And Moshe, is Moshe a successful leader, or ultimately, in some ways, unsuccessful?
Yeah.
In regard to that relationship, which is human.
Yeah.
And so it's complex. I'm suggesting there are issues here that are complex, and there are issues of disappointment.
Right. Right. So let's stay with that for a second, because one of the questions I have is, does Yitro ultimately accept Moshe's invitation, or does he not?
He does.
Doesn't look like it.
His initial reaction is to say, no, I'm going back to my homeland. But then Moshe says, no, you really have to come with us, right? You were our eyes in the desert. Every good that God promised us, he's going to give for you. And the story seems to end there, right? We don't get Yitro's response. So what do you think? So? Robert's of the opinion that Yitro left. He did not continue on with them. Does everyone agree with Robert?
He goes, but Yitro comes back and is given land around Yericho.
Okay, so Anne is pointing to something we find later on in Navi, in Sefer Shmuel. Is that where it's referenced? Yeah, in Shmuel Bet. So in Shmuel Bet, we see that there is the descendants of the Cani is living near Yericho. So most understand that to be the descendants of Yitro.
Yeah.
So that would indicate that Yitro did go into the land. But not everyone buys that. Some say it was Yitro did leave, but he actually let's go there now. I need to remember which source it was. Okay, so let's go to number 5 and number 6. We'll start with Rashi, although he doesn't mention this explicitly, but Rashi says, Al na ta'azov, do not leave us. Ein na ela lashon bakasha. When the word na appears, it indicates a request. Shelo yomru lo nitgayer yitro mechiba. Savor haya sheyesh lagerim chelek ba'aretz. Achshav shara she'en lem chelek hinicham v'halach lo. Right? Rashi is concerned of the PR, the public relations implications, if Yitro doesn't stay with them. What are people going to say if Yitro leaves? Yitro didn't really believe in God. Yitro wasn't a sincere convert. He thought he would join on with the Jewish people and get a nice inheritance in the land of Israel, get a nice portion of land. Once he hears that converts don't get land, that's why he left. He left because he wasn't going to get any land. So that would cause a big chilul Hashem. That would cause others to question Yitro's sincerity and perhaps question the authenticity of God and of Judaism. Let's go to number 7. The Chizkuni also says very similarly. Davar acher, an alternative explanation. Geirim acherim yistaklu b'cha v'yitnu leiv l'hitzgayer. Right? Moshe says that other potential converts to Judaism are going to look to you, Yitro. If you stay with us and you remain committed and loyal and faithful and part of the Jewish people, then that will be a good way to ensure that there'll be further converts to the Jewish people. If you leave, then not so much. But now the Sforno, which is what I really wanted to look at, says, Ki alma alkin yadata chanotenu b'midbar, you knew our encampments in the desert. V'im ya'azvenu gam banecha tichalalu et Hashem b'nei ha'umot. And okay, you're going to leave, and if your children leave, then that will desecrate God's name among the other nations. Sheyomru ilu ra'a Yitro b'hem inyan eloki be'emet lo haya ozev otam hu banav. They would say that had Yitro saw some real truth in God and in Judaism, then neither he nor his children would have left. Uvazeh hiskim Moshe v'Yitro banav, ki omnam Yitro chazar el artso. So on this, they all agreed. Yitro agreed that they wanted to make a good impression on future converts to Judaism. So, omnam Yitro chazar el artso, Yitro did in fact return to his homeland, as it says in Sefer Shmot that Moshe sent Yitro away. But his children went with Bnei Israel. So, and the children of Yitro, who we read about in Sefer Shmuel, right, according to Sforno and others, doesn't mean that Yitro went with them. Right? Yitro ensured that his family would go with him, but he himself didn't. So it's a really interesting question, right? And it's even stranger if we think about all the tremendous credit we give to Yitro when he comes in Sefer Shmot and, right, seemingly full force in with the Jewish people, gives Moshe advice on how they should conduct their affairs. Everyone listens to him. He seems to be given great respect and privilege. And now he's just, he abandons it. He abandoned ship. And it is very curious.
I found it very interesting what Robert said about Yitro believing in God, and versus believing in Moshe, or that's more like the politics and the people, but rather than simply directly the belief in God. Yeah,
I'm sure there's a good father-in-law joke to make around that also. But it strikes us as strange. It's a curious detail that it should even be a question. Meaning, even for those who say that he did in fact go, why would it be a question? Is just totally off script. But it could also be highlighting some of the inner psyche and the inner struggles that converts have, right? As convinced as they are of the truth of the conversion and of Judaism, it's very difficult to completely cut off ties from your family and the life that you knew. And, maybe that's something, maybe the Torah wishes to show us. Yitro struggled with that, right? Even someone as great as Yitro, who we take to be the paradigm and the epitome for future converts, this was something that was still a struggle for him. And so maybe we need to, be more sympathetic to the experience of converts, right? Some would say we have to therefore be more suspicious, right? We have to really know that they're sincere and without any doubt whatsoever. So maybe they could turn to this also. That was totally off the cuff, that suggestion. Okay, so go ahead, please.
I was interested to see that the language of Yitro's wanting to return is almost the converse of Abraham's
yes
embracing God's journey for him, I guess. The only thing that's missing sort of is your father's house, but Yitro was of an age that would no longer be relevant.
There are those who develop that parallel. I didn't go that way this year, but there is, if you want to explore it further, there's what on the internet to help you explore that a little bit further. Okay, so we'll look at some of the other details that we pointed out, and then we'll look at some of the bigger picture. So, Hayita lanu le'inayim. Moshe says to Yitro, you were for us eyes. Rashi, back on page 1, source number 3. Hayita lanu le'inayim, lashon avar. So he says this is in the past tense, right? You were, in our travels in the desert, you were our eyes, right? So most assume that means that it refers to the advice that Yitro gave as Moshe set up the courts, or convincing Moshe to set up the court system. Others say that perhaps Yitro just had familiarity with the desert and the terrain that he offered them as they were trying to figure out Survival Skills 101. They had it pretty easy. They had the man, they had the clouds of glory to protect them, but still having an experienced trailblazer with them might have been beneficial in that way as well. Then Rashi says, Davar acher, lashon atid, right? That this is actually not in the past tense referring to previous advice that Yitro gave, but it refers to something in the future. Kol davar v'davar shitalem me'einenu, tiyeh me'ir einenu. Anything in the future that we will not know, that will be hidden from our eyes, you will enlighten us. Right? That he recognizes Yitro has some wisdom, has some insight, has some life experience, right? Whether he's talking about leadership experience, whether he's talking about just kind of what it means to live with a settled nation, whatever it is, Yitro has wisdom to offer. And Moshe needs that wisdom, right? He doesn't know what he just knows that Yitro can offer wise counsel, and it's good to keep him around. He's going to be helpful. Then the final approach of Rashi, Davar acher, a third interpretation, Shetehei chaviv aleinu kigalgal einenu, that you'll be as precious to us as the pupil of our eye. Right? It's a very endearing phrase that Rashi in that take maybe Moshe is just trying to convince him that it's in Yitro's best interest, forgetting about what he has to offer to Bnei Israel, but that we're going to treat you really, really well, so therefore you should stick around because it's going to be of benefit to you. All right, that's just a sampling of how that's approached. We don't need to see every single permutation of it. Another interesting detail of this story, if we go back to the Psukim, right, after Yitro says no, and Moshe says, no, we really need you to come, we're going to be so kind to you, it's going to be good for you. And then the Torah tells us, I'm just scrolling back here, in verse 33, Vayisume har Hashem derech shloshet yamim, They traveled from the mountain of God. Again, unclear whether Yitro was with them or not, whether he accepts Moshe's invitation, or he, in fact, returns back to Midian. And the Ark of God, the covenant of God, traveled before them for 3 days, in order to find for them a resting place. Something's very strange about that. Anyone see that detail as strange? I think Rena's onto something.
I don't know. It seems like the ark is going on its own. And it's like, it seems as if the ark itself is scouting out the land to come back and tell the people where they should
Yeah,
rest.
so first of all, what does it mean that the ark is scouting out a resting place, right? Arks don't have eyes, right? So most understand that to mean in whatever way God communicated that they should travel, that the ark would get the message, or the message was translated through the ark or whatever, and so they knew where to stop. But it is a very strange phrase. But the other thing that's a bit seemingly out of whack is if we look in source number 8, and this we don't need to look in any detail or any great detail, but in source number 8,
Just in case.
we have the description of how how they in fact would travel in the desert. Again, this is from chapter 2. This is from Parsha Bamidbar, before they actually traveled in this way. This is the theory of how they should travel. And the way that they would travel is, remember, they were set up surrounding the Mishkan, and the Ark was in the middle, and all the tribes were around them. And so whenever they would travel, they would travel in that formation. So the 3 tribes that were on the front side of the Aron would go first. And then the Aron, along with the tribes in the flank, would go. And then the tribes in the rear. So the way that they're supposed to travel is with the Aron in the middle. And here we're told that Aron Brit Hashem Nosea Lifneihem, that it went out in front of them. So there's a lot of discussion about why is that the case? What's going on here? Rashi, in fact, says that when it says that the Aron went in front of them, it wasn't the real Aron, that there were 2 Arons. That there was one Aron that contained in it the luchot, the tablets, and had on it the kruvim, and that's the Aron that we think of when we talk of the Aron. And in fact, there was a second Aron that had in it the shivrei luchot, the fragments of the tablets that had been broken. Most understand that there was only one Aron that had both the luchot and the shivrei luchot and the fragments. But Rashi suggests that no, the Aron that we think of when we say the Aron never departed the center of the camp. That's where it traveled. So if there was an Aron going out in front of them, it had to be a different one. Rashi says that actually that's, if we look at descriptions later on in the Torah, when they went to war, that there was an Aron that would go to war with them. That was not the same Aron from the Mishkan. That was the Aron with the shivrei luchot, with the fragments. That was more mobile and perhaps, I don't want to say less kadosh, but had more flexibility in where it could be and what situations it could find itself. So that's one understanding of what it means that the Aron went in front of them. Really interesting insight in source number 9 from Rabbi Michael Haddon, who has a lot of shiurim posted on the virtual Beit Midrash, Yeshivat Har Etzion. He has books that have been published, and I think he probably writes in English. I've never met him. I don't know for sure. But anyway, he has a lot of books available on different elements of Tanakh. And he says, I'll just kind of summarize, but he says, why was there a need for the Aron to go in front of them at this point? He says that they were scared. They didn't know. This was the first time they were traveling. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were totally terrified. And so they needed the Aron to provide guidance, right? And he points back and he says, in fact, in our psukim, it says, not only did the Aron go in front of them, but Anan Hashem Alehem Yomam bin Asami Namachaneh. there was a protective cloud of God over them, right? The Aron, which did provide that protection, was now out in front leading the way. So a different cloud came in to provide additional protection and security for them, so that they were terrified. They didn't know what to do. And so they needed the Aron, they needed the ark to show them and to guide them and to provide them some assurance that what they were doing was the right thing and that they could do it. And he says, in fact, this is, Yitro picked up on this, or Yitro is in contrast to this. He says, what's the point of Yitro in this whole story? Is Yitro was someone who was so sure of himself. Right? Yitro didn't lack any confidence. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly where he came from. He knew where he wanted to go. And so perhaps Moshe asking Yitro to stay with them was because of that confidence that Yitro brought, that everything is going to be okay, and Yitro is someone who brought that assurance to them. Yitro leaves, and then everything is, is back to the chaos that was. Or that
It's not enough.
Afraid of.
Sorry, it's not enough that there's Amud Anan by day and Amud Eish by night. That's that which led them through 40 years, essentially. That's strange.
I don't know, these people were slaves, Robert. They were slaves, and their fathers were slaves, and their grandfathers were slaves, and their great-grandfathers were slaves, and they couldn't think for themselves yet. They really couldn't. And, they didn't know where and what. This is uncharted territory. You can't blame.
They didn't have a map.
They didn't have a map.
They had guides, but the question was, the guides didn't have anything to show as a map either. Even a Sefer Torah didn't exist as a material thing in full, at least at a certain moment.
Right, and we might also add to this that there was, whether at what point they became aware of it, but at some point this miraculous existence was going to stop. Right, even if they did have the protection of the clouds and of the pillar of fire, whatever else, and the man falling, right, at some point it was going to stop. And so even if they could confidently follow after the Aron, it was with that trepidation of, well, what are we going to do when this is no longer the situation? And so let me just, let's go down to number 12 and another passage from Rabbi Haddon's analysis of the situation. Chovav responds by saying his intentions are to return to his own land and birthplace, thus highlighting the centrality of the land theme. That which Israel yearns for, Chovav already possesses. He therefore stands to gain nothing by accompanying them on their journey. He can remain their spiritual ally and sincere friend while yet keeping his nomadic ways. And he need not relinquish his ties to his land or to his birthplace in the process of adopting Israel's God and their destiny as his own. Okay, so that raises a lot of interesting points, right? First of all, it talks about the confidence of Yitro, right? And all the good that Moshe says you're going to gain by coming with us. Is it really such an enticing offer? So according to this understanding, maybe it's not such an enticing offer. Then he raises some really interesting questions which resonate for me with the current events going on, and kind of all the news and all the debate back and forth about advocacy for Israel, criticism of Israel, and unfortunately the rising attacks of anti-Semitism, right? But this question about how to be a good ally, how to be a spiritual ally, is a really interesting question. I just wanted to point it out as something to think about. I don't have much more to say about it at the moment, but the idea that Yitro doesn't have to be, right, and I think for us and Jews in America, standing from a distance watching all this unfold, right, what it means that we can remain a spiritual ally with our brothers and sisters in Israel, from a distance while keeping to our lifestyle here, right? How much we need to be all in is a really, really core question about what it means to be a Jew living in the diaspora. And I think it is an interesting way of thinking about this story. Certainly, Bnei Israel, even if Yitro doesn't come with them, could certainly use some allies from afar, and that's always helpful. So does that change our disappointment in Yitro deciding to leave? I'm just raising questions.
One of the things you haven't mentioned is that Yitro was the head of a group of people, and he had a responsibility to them.
Right. We don't know what happens to the people he was in charge of, right?
Right. And he's not talking to just any person who wishes to convert. He's talking to someone who has the responsibility to take care of a group of people. So I think it is certainly important to raise the question of what kind of changes in our own lives culturally as Jews in America are we willing to take? How many changes are we willing to make in order to support Israel?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. But not all of us are the heads of and have the responsibility for. I mean, we don't know how many wives he had. We don't know how many other families depended upon him. Very few of us are actually in that kind of a position. Some of us are, but not very many of us. So, but he's beginning to realize that if he's going to follow the Torah, he is going to have to change in some way.
Yeah.
And the Kenites were always regarded, and the Rechabites also, as semi-nomadic peoples. They had a place to stay, but they could leave whenever they felt they needed to.
Yeah.
So, and we are in a culture that is in many ways so different than the culture of Eretz Israel. And how many changes are we willing to make? So I think it's a great question.
Yeah. You raised many more great questions. Thank you. Sorry, was someone else going to speak? No. So two more just sort of ideas to put out there as we try to put a full picture together of this Yitro character and the exchange between him and Moshe. The Ramban picks up on the verse that we've just been focused on, right? That we've been focused on the Aaron going before them. But the verse begins, "Vayisu mehar Hashem derech shloshet yamim." The Aaron brit Hashem noseh lifneim. They traveled from the Mount of God, a journey of a 3 days journey. The Ramban quotes the Midrash, "Vayisu mehar Hashem." They left the mountain. They traveled from the mountain of God. The Ramban quotes the Midrash in source number 14.
Well, you got to move up, Rabbi Kappelwood.
I got to move
We're
down.
at 12.
Right? Yeah.
Or down, as the case may be. Okay.
Yeah. So it's really just one line in the Ramban. Do you see my mouse if I move it around?
No.
Seeing it? No? Okay. What if
There. Yeah, just be there on the left.
I'm not finding the line right now on the sheet. I was going to try to highlight it for you so you could see what I'm reading. But he says, the Yisu mehar Hashem, they departed the mountain of God, Kitino kaboreach mibeir hasefer, like a child running away from school. Where does this come from? Right? You know, we're coming up on the, I don't know, Robert, Beatrice, is your semester all done? Grades submitted? If they're not, then it's coming soon, I know. Right, I know that the countdown in my house has begun. The end of school is nigh. right? So there's great excitement about school coming to an end and the children leaving. But we wouldn't think of that excitement when we think about leaving Har Sinai, where we got the Torah from, right? We would think that that would be sad to be leaving. So where does the Midrash get the idea that they were excited?
Well, if they're on their way to settle in the land, which has been the great promise, more even than giving the Torah, you will have your own place as opposed to being slaves. So maybe that's what the excitement is. Okay, this is the obligation, but now we get to the prize. Keep your eyes on the prize.
So many say if that were the case, then it should have said they traveled towards Israel. It didn't say that they left Har Sinai. It should say, right, that they were excited for the destination rather than the departure. That's what many say. I agree with you. There might be something about, okay, now we're going to get to put into practice whatever it is that we just learned. And there certainly is that excitement upon a graduation or completion of school. So anyway, there seems to be some negative underpinnings here. And my friend, Rabbi Donnie Rockoff, who's a rabbi in Denver, suggested that here, maybe, thinking back to Yitro and why he did not ultimately stay with them, I would suggest that Yitro saw something in the attitude of Bnei Israel that displeased him, and therefore he did not wish to join them. There was a lack of gratitude and appreciation for what God had done for them that he sensed. For an outsider who had traveled all this way after recognizing the great miracles God had performed, this was something he was very sensitive to. That somehow this Midrash is picking up, and it's not so crazy if you look at what happens, just the next chapter, complaints after complaints after complaints, that there was a lack of gratitude and there was a lack of basic common, ethics perhaps, or morality that we would have expected from this great nation who experienced so many wonderful things. And he says maybe that's what Yitro was picking up on, and he decided ultimately not to travel with them.
Are they a great nation?
Are they
at that point? They are slaves of recent vintage. They are disoriented. They've been removed from the place they'd been for hundreds of years. The food has changed. All this is changing. They're worried about where are we going, even with a divine cloud above and an Aron Kodesh with the broken luchot and so. All these things, it's not enough. They have questions that they're worried about the possibility, as you alluded before, to what happens the day after the mun stops? What happens after the springs of Miriam are no longer available, when we got to get back into quote unquote regular life, which is not regular for them? They're worried and they have questions. They have questions about all these different things. And if you're making a shidduch, the custom of wise people is to ask questions before the Tnoim are signed and before the chuppah is taken care of, because it's serious and they're nervous.
Okay, so we might say that they have the potential to be a great nation.
They're orphans. They are orphan princes and princesses. And the Rav Nachman of Braslov has one of his stories that goes on and on and on about the lost prince and princess who are somewhere in dungeons and they're enslaved and this and that, and they don't know who they really are. They are not aware of just how amazing they are. Or as Star Wars would say, that the force is strong within them. It's an amazing something. That takes time and experience to learn, to adapt, to adjust. And it's not something that could be done instantaneously, because if it was done instantaneously, they would be turned from being human beings to malachim.
Right.
And apparently the plan is that we're human.
That is the plan, yes. One more suggestion in making sense of this story. And this was clearly influenced by the setting. When I was working at Brandeis as a rabbi, Parshat Beha'alotecha fell out on reunion weekend. And so in the context of reunion, I had the thought that maybe the message of Yitro is that there are going to be people in your life that are going to have a profound impact on your life in the moment. And then you're going to part ways with them. And right, it's, in the context of reunion, everyone is always so regretful over how did we lose touch, how we were so close to you, And right, maybe the message is that that's part of life too. Part of life is that appreciate those people that are impactful on your life when they're making an impact, and realize that then they might not continue to be a part of your life in the same way moving forward, and that's part of what it means to be human also, is to have those relationships that have more intense and less intense, and when you're able to reconnect, that's amazing. That's fantastic. And certainly we've been in reunion situations where we then do keep in touch with those friends that we hadn't been in touch with for 20 years prior. But that's not always the case, and that's okay too. And that's part of what life is. So that was my thought, my insight into this Yitro encounter. You can take it or leave it, I don't know. And as is usually the case, I'm not sure that I have any concrete answers or a whole unifying theory about what's going on here, but I think it's a very rich story, and I hope that some of these questions help you to make more sense of it, or to give it some more thought. If there are any final comments or questions, or anyone else,
I think that there's a lot to be considered about a possible convert to Judaism at this present day. So much of what we have here regarding God, regarding society and Jewish society and all that in practice, I think there's a lot, and home and new home and all that stuff. I think there's a lot in this parsha that suggests to me a lot of consideration for these people.
Yeah, definitely. If we combine that with the first time we encounter, or not the first, when we encounter Yitro and Sefer Shemot, when he comes to join with Bnei Israel, I can't remember if in this shiur we discussed it ever, but there's all sorts of theories about what prompted Yitro to come and join with them. And some of those theories tie very neatly into some of the reasons that people have for converting to Judaism nowadays. Was it a spiritual quest? Was it a family issue? Was it promise of a better life? Was it an intellectual curiosity that led him? So yeah, he definitely raises a lot of sensibilities when it comes to how we relate to converts in our community, and how we can be more accepting and simply empathetic to their situation. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, we will say Lila Tov for tonight. Next week, back to Tuesday evenings, back to our normal schedule time, I think. This is, end of school. There's a lot of stuff going on. So I think next Tuesday, though, we're in the clear. So I look forward to seeing everyone then. Have a good night and a good rest of the week.
Good night. Good
Lila
night.
Tov,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Good night.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Good night.